first point I want to make is that the higher education sector has changed unbelievably over the course of the last 50 years. Some 50 or so years ago, only 6% of young people went to university, and they were broadly white, middle-class, young. Then there were only 45 universities. Now we, as the Office for Students, this new regulator in England, we are registering everyone who wants to offer registered higher education in England. We have had literally hundreds of applications to join our register, not 45, hundreds. Then universities broadly did the same thing, more or less. They did teaching, they did research. Now it's far more diverse, working with employers, working with a whole range of partners locally and globally. Then, you don't need me to tell you, university was free. Now it's paid for by students through graduate contributions, heavily subsidised by government as well. And in those days, there was such a thing as broadly a single model of a university, to which most people broadly subscribed. But now the sector's growth is matched by a growth in stakeholders and perspectives about what it is that universities should do. Government, employers, the public, communities, and of course the huge diversity of students, young and mature. My challenge is this, that for many people, the model of the university remains what it was 50 or 60 years ago, measured on a single spectrum as to what a university should be, and somehow we've not managed to join together coherently what society now needs. So I think the answer to this is we've simply got to stop measuring higher education by reference to a historic benchmark. I think we've got to stop driving by looking in a rather rigid and small rear-view mirror. It's got to be much more inclusive and generative and open and forward-looking, and somehow we've got to stop aspiring to sending our young children, our young students, to a single model of university. We've got to embrace diversity and think not just about young students, but all of us. I believe, to finish, that the Office for Students, the organisation that I run, has a part to play in this. We ourselves are absolutely not going to be defining what higher education should look like. We don't think that's our job. Quite the opposite. What we're going to be doing in the way we operate is enabling diverse provision. We're going to regulate according to a common threshold so that every student can be assured that the quality is there and they can rely on that if they go to a registered higher education provider. But the way we will operate will not distinguish between new providers, old providers, history, future. We will be encouraging diversity of provision and encouraging diversity of students. But I think as a society, all of us, we've got to move on and look to higher education playing a role in the future. It's got to be an open book, not a closed book. We have to look forward, not backwards. What in detail that ends up looking like, let's hear from the other speakers. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Michael.
Thank you. I'm going to stride around because if I sit down, I have my back to half of you, so I'm going to walk around like, so I hope you don't mind. And then I will sit down and behave myself. I am the rector of Central European University in Budapest in Hungary. It's a graduate institution that trains about 1,800 students a year from 120 countries in the social sciences and humanities. And the government of Hungary wants to shut it down. I will not share my pain with you about it. I'm just telling you that's where we are. Challenge number one, in other words, for many universities is to secure their independence, their institutional autonomy from the state. I am in a university that is being strangled by a government. This is a story in Turkey, it's a story in Russia, it's a story in China, it's a story in the Middle East. So that's the first thing I would say, and the bottom line is you only have free universities and the institutional autonomy of universities in a democracy. It's just a basic point. Universities have a huge future as long as democracy has a future. As long as British democracy is strong, universities will be strong. Second point is the connection between universities and democracy is very old. Universities are among the oldest self-governing institutions on earth. Some of them are 1,000 years old. And that's kind of inspiring if you're in my spot, because it tells you something important. Regimes come and go, bad politics comes and goes, and universities actually remain and endure. And so if you ask, what is the future of the university's future is as bright, in my view, as this ideal of a self-governing community of scholars. That in turn is dependent on democracy. It can survive long periods without democracy, but the two are deeply connected. Two other thoughts. The university is not just challenged by states, it's also challenged by the market. There are some things that we try to teach which are really beyond price. The marketization of education, the commodification of education cuts at the heart of what we're trying to do, which is to get eyeball to eyeball and teach each other, right? It doesn't have a price, and we lose it very quickly if we forget that at the core of a university is a very personal, intimate relationship between a teacher and the student. The smaller the class, the better, right? So in a future for the university, digital stuff will be extremely important. Do we want access? Of course, we want to throw the doors open so everybody can have access. But there is a risk that if we digitize and marketize this relationship, we'll destroy what it is that happens when great teaching occurs, and great teaching is the core of what universities have to do. The final thing I would say, so far I've been democratic, and I hope I've been radically egalitarian about who university is for. Now I'm going to say something that is starkly and unapologetically elitist. We are in the business of holding on to, preserving, and transmitting knowledge. And there is such a thing. In a world of tweets, rumors, fantasies, paranoia, Facebook posts, the deluge of information, it is more important than ever to hold on to the idea that there is such a thing as knowledge. Some things happen to be true, some things happen to be false, and the business of a university is to train young people and older people and anybody we can to understand the difference between knowledge, opinion, fantasy, rumor, and straight-out paranoia. And we have a huge problem with that. The university's authority is being challenged precisely because people are saying, what do we need experts for? What do we need knowledge for? We're all empowered by those damn machines, so what do we need all this stuff for? And I'm here to say, you can't get to knowledge without discipline. There are such things as disciplines. They're hard to learn. Biology is a discipline. History is a discipline. Networks, cognitive science is a discipline. It takes a long time to learn how to do it. Once you have the mastery of a discipline, you've got the only granite under your feet you're ever going to need. And we have to get back to the core of that and believe in it passionately in a world in which we've relativized knowledge to such a degree that we can't get closure. We can't get agreement in political debates. We can't base public policy on anything that looks like the facts. And universities are at the center of that process, and that's what we're here to do, and that's what we need to do, and we need to make sure that everybody gets a chance at knowledge. There you go.
Khadija. Thank you, Michael. That was fantastic.
So I'm here today to tell you that as a student, university is no longer relevant for the world of work that exists today. So before I started university, I was told that university is an environment that allows you to streamline your passions, streamline the energy that you taught and the work that you taught in school straight into the field of work. Now, that's not how university works for me today. I understand that university, and from the show of hands in the room here today, that system has absolutely failed us as students. We now live in a world where having a degree is no longer relevant, and I'll explain why that's the case in 2 key points. The first is that university has failed to adapt to the changing world that we live in today. We live in a highly automated world where technology, like the Slido balls you're going to see around the room a little bit later on, is a key innovator and change in the industries, across industries in the UK and across the world today. These fast-changing industries now mean that employers are asking and prefer for graduates with skills in coding, website building, and social media management. So you're probably wondering what I'm studying. I study digital culture, which is probably the most millennial-sounding degree you could possibly think of. It's a degree that didn't exist 4 years ago. It's new, it's current, it's exciting, but it's still being taught in the same ancient and ineffective way that universities still teach today. I wholeheartedly believe that experience is more valuable than a degree. And with a widening pool of graduates, a degree no longer sets us apart, but has become the standard. I have friends that decided not to go to university, diving straight into work and doing the jobs that I want to do once I graduate. They now have 3 years' worth of experience, practical experience, and I'm yet to have a piece of paper. Now, if you're an employer, I'm asking you who you consider might be more worthy for a job. Tuition fees have more than tripled, and almost 50% of students now move on to higher education. However, the student experience and the quality of teaching has remained largely the same. In short, there are more students who pay more, but are graduating with less than what employers are looking for. A report recently published by CBI found that 1/3 of businesses are dissatisfied with the skills that graduates leave with in key areas such as self-management and resilience. Very quickly into my first year, I realized that university is essentially a really expensive book club with steep annual membership rates. We read a book, if that, we mostly deal with a synopsis, and then we talk about that book, we write about that book, and we leave with little to no knowledge of how that applies in practice. University has now become about learning what we already know, and in a world full of problems, the pressure for finding solutions is often resting on young people. How can we do this if we're not given the means to be able to pick apart those issues in an innovative and inquisitive way? We should no longer be content with learning on the job, but rather our job as students is to learn how to effectively solve and manage those problems in a way that will allow us to be able to deal with it way before we enter the workplace. Finally, if we want universities to remain relevant, and we do, we should revisit some of its founding principles of learning through questioning rather than learning the answers to questions that have already been asked. When university was relevant, it was a space to explore, discuss, and build on ideas. The student experience came out of prioritizing personal development and recognizing the potential we have to change the world. Universities have effectively become businesses that have failed to prepare us for the world of business. So, the solution is to promote challenge-driven universities where students are allowed to pick apart at real-life problems and to come to those solutions collaboratively in that space. So, once that environment is established, then, and only then, will having a degree be truly relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Khadija. Tom.
Okay.
A wonderfully provocative presentation.
I'm a student, you have to, don't you?
Okay, 3 difficult acts to follow. My first job in higher education was teaching on an access to higher education course in Liverpool. I was a relatively recent graduate, and I was sent out to Anfield, which many of you know is a relatively working class area of Liverpool, to teach initially Shakespeare's Othello. And the first thing that happened in that class, the first thing I said, was something that I considered to be a fact, and we've already talked a bit about facts, about marriage in Shakespeare's Othello. And the first thing that a student said in response to me, and I'll call the student Wendy, was that actually she knew from experience that I was wrong about marriage, and she knew that Shakespeare was wrong as well. And that sense of dialogue informed a lot of what went on in the subsequent year of that course. And I'm using that anecdote just to kind of frame my remarks today, because to me, the biggest challenge to higher education for the next 50 years is this question of who universities are for. And you've seen that question or that thread running through all of the talks that we've just heard. And to me, the big kind of innovation that we could make over the next decade is to completely rethink who goes to the university, at what point in their life they go, whether they go in one block or they go in multiple tries, and that we should be aiming for a really radically inclusive target of who participates in university, something like 90% or above. But what it means to participate in university also has to therefore change, as well as how you get there and what the admissions criteria are. So why does this matter? Well, you might expect, given where I started, that I'd talk first of all about social justice. And obviously that's a really important part of this. But actually, the principal driver for this sort of change is economic. If you think about it, it's crazy that our starting assumption in universities, and this is true all around the world, is that the student is 18 or thereabouts, that they're going to study full-time, and that then they're going to go off into the world of work. And that this model has come to us from a time when universities educated a very tiny number of upper-class men who went into a profession that they did for life. And that couldn't be more different from the university sector that Nicola described and from the world of work, and the way in which we know the world of work is going to change with what's being called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. People aren't going to have that kind of job for life anymore. And actually, that's going to change more rapidly in the next 10 or 15 years, even than the last 10 or 15 years. Just to give you one stat on that, which took my breath away, the OECD think that in industrialized countries, in work, about a third of the skills that people currently use in work will change radically by 2020. So if you then extrapolate that and think about where we'll be in 2050, I think, as other speakers, as Khadija particularly has already talked about, we're not keeping up as universities with that pace of change in the world of work. So that's the first driver. The second reason why I think this change is important is it would actually be good for universities as well. That sort of change in how we educate students and who we admit would allow us to rethink all sorts of fundamentals. We'd be able to rethink our curricula, we'd be able to rethink how we admit students, we might even abolish the point of graduation, have students coming back throughout the course of their life. It would have implications for how we do research as well. And it would allow us to start resetting some of the most stale debates in higher education. Who wants to debate again tuition fees versus free education? Actually, at the heart of that debate is often the question, who benefits? And if we reset the question of who benefits, that allows us to have that debate about how we pay for it in a completely different way. And similarly to that, I think this whole question of the relationship to business and industry and the world of work is really important. If we were aiming for sort of 90% of participation, and say a majority of those students were also working while they studied, or raising a family, or participating in civic life in other ways, then think about how that also changes the relationship to business and industry and people's sense of how the skills that they're developing interact with that world of work. But the third reason why this kind of change, I think, is really important is that as universities, we have to face head-on the fact that there is a crisis of trust in expertise, and expertise is one of the things that we represent, as Michael's already talked about so eloquently. And in a sense, I think we have to be honest about this and say it shouldn't be a surprise to us, in a sense, that there is this crisis, because there are whole communities to whom we're not only inaccessible, we're actually kind of invisible as institutions. Just a couple of statistics that sort of illustrate this. In Mexico, 1% of the indigenous population goes to university. In South Africa, 1 in 6 Africans or coloureds, which are the official terms, go to university compared to half of whites. And in a sense, we've perhaps become a bit complacent in this country about thinking we've started to solve some of this. We've made enormous differences, as Nicola's talked about, but there is an invisible crisis going on in this country. We have 60% fewer part-time students than we had in 2010. I know I'm telling you things that you know, Nicola. And actually, if you factor those in, overall, there are about 200,000 fewer undergraduates than there were in 2010. And the Open University studies of this suggest that there are about 15% fewer disadvantaged students as well. So in a sense, we're moving slightly in the wrong direction in terms of who's involved in the conversation. Why does that matter? Well, I think this is a democratic question too. And I think if we're facing a crisis in democracy, it's partly a crisis about what forms of knowledge we hold in common in society and what kinds of conversation we have. The single biggest predictor of how someone would vote in our most recent election, in the American presidential election, and in the EU referendum was not age, it wasn't social class, it was whether or not someone had been to higher education. And that is a sign that we are having two or more conversations in our society that aren't kind of meeting one another and talking to one another. And I think, in a sense, we have to see ourselves in universities as partly being kind of culpable for that. Because if there are whole swathes of people who don't take for granted the expertise that we think is really important, or perhaps more importantly, haven't had a chance to test that expertise against their own experience, we need to think about the modes of participation that would change that. And in that sense, I think the really big challenge for universities over the next 50 years, over the next 5 years, is to change themselves. And this is important because a lot of the crises that we as societies are going to face over the next 50 years will also hinge on crises of participation. If you think about issues about migration and forced migration, about scarcity of resource, about democracy and governance, which is becoming increasingly challenging in all sorts of regions. If you think about things like digital inclusion, and if you think also about the rapid growth of inequality that the changes in the economy might prompt, then I think there's a really good case for saying that we need to reimagine the dialogue between expertise and experience, not to reach some happy place where we all agree with each other, but trying to find ways in which we can hear each other, which I actually think universities are a really good space for, and can live with each other where we disagree. And that to do that, we need to be open to the kinds of dialogue and the kinds of positive challenge, I think, that are represented by that sort of challenge that came out of experience to expertise in the story that I told about Wendy at the start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Before turning to you, the audience, we're just going to have a few questions amongst ourselves. I have absolutely hundreds, and I'm going to restrain myself, apart from one. I would really be interested to hear, Michael, how you answer the challenge, expressed in different ways from Khadija and Tom, about the need for a responsiveness for real-world employability and skills that don't necessarily relate to the knowledge point, critically important though that is.
Well, this is going to come out hostile. I actually thought you gave a great talk. But I did think to myself, why don't she just drop out? I mean, you know, and to which now I'm putting words in your mouth and you're going to talk for yourself. But one answer might be that the reason you've stayed is you've learned a lot of stuff that's actually not useful for post-graduation employment. You've learned some other stuff. And so then the question is, what is a university education actually doing for you? It's not necessarily fitting you into a job, but it might be doing something else. So that's one possibility. The second thing, I mean, I thought all these were extremely interesting. I guess my question is, are we asking universities to do too much? It's never been part of the history of university tells you that a countless number of the inventions, life-changing discoveries, great works of art that have made everyone in this room's life better had nothing to do with universities, actually. So let's then get down to what universities actually can do, would be my only response to this. I mean, if you're saying we're going into a future where everybody needs some kind of education and needs constant re-education, I sure do. I'm essentially functionally illiterate in lots of ways in the 21st century. I need to go back to school. But should I be going to a university? I mean, so those are the kind of questions. Both are you asking too much of a university education that's too narrowly vocational and missing what other things universities do? And then for you, are you sort of wanting university to take over the entire challenge of meeting the 21st century. And I just don't think we can. I don't think we should. I would go further and say we should lose our monopoly. That is, we have a monopoly on credentialing, young 18 to 21-year-olds, and you're, Khadija, extremely impatient about that because you're saying the credential is bloody useless, right? So part of where your future, I think, the future you're pointing to is let's lose the monopoly. Lots of people won't go to university because it's useless, or because they want to do something else, or because their creativity is being restrained by all the stuff I care about, which is boring disciplines and knowledge and, all that stuff, right?
Well, you've thrown a fantastic challenge back to Khadija. I think you've got to have the right to reply to that. Do you wish you hadn't gone to university?
Yeah, at some points I do. Like I said, particularly with a degree like mine, it's incredibly important that that practice is interlinked to the theory. There's absolutely no point. Are we asking too much of universities? Absolutely not. In fact, that's how some of them are marketed. If I go back to some of the brochures that I opened, that's precisely how they see themselves. So it's not me asking for too much, it's me asking for what
they promise.
Exactly, what's been marketed. Do it. I should have dropped out. Now you say it, maybe I'm not against the idea of university at all. I just think that universities can do better and should do better for young people.
Fair answer.
Hello. This is also in response to Khadija. I agree that universities could and should do better, but I disagree that they haven't prepared us for the world of work. I think that there are many skills that you do learn at university, like how to think critically, how to absorb and then summarize and communicate lots of information to people that otherwise don't know about it. I sometimes think that young people are lazy in how they search for what university has taught them. It's not there to just be handed to us on a plate. We have to think about, okay, what have I learned? How can I deploy this when I'm not in this context? And that's something that is a life skill that I think the environment of a university does foster. At the same time, I'm quite privileged in that, I come from a very critical humanities department that's very politically active. So that's just my perspective on it.
Fantastic, thank you. There's quite a few questions.
This is about the monopoly point. I'm an apprentice who's just finished his second year doing the BTEC and then going onto a degree in January. But it's very hard for people to find out about apprenticeships. I only found out about it because my dad worked as part of the government and was promoting this type of thing. I was in a very lucky situation to know what this was.
Yeah. I want to come back on that because it's a really good point, but there was a question over here, and then we'll do another round.
Thanks. You highlighted concerns around quality in UK higher education. I would push back and say university was always expensive, except instead of us paying for it later through loans, the state paid for it, we all paid for it. But Nicola, how would you respond to Khadija's point around quality? Was she actually missold her course?
Yeah. In fact, there's a thread. Sorry, I'm going to leap in here and take advantage of having the chair. There is a thread here, I wonder, about the information, advice and guidance that you all had, because there's an assumption you go to university, and I think it has to be a choice. It goes back to your point. Students need to really actively decide this is right for them. They need to decide beyond that where to go and what to study, and I really do worry that that information is not out there and is not being as effective as it could be, and in particular is not reaching those who have the most need of it. So I think there's a real challenge here about making sure that information, advice and guidance is effective, and that might have affected your decision about what and where to study. Because actually it's not a binary thing. It's, it could have been another course would have been better for you, but I wonder whether you were encouraged to think in those terms.
I think one quick thing I'd just say is I think apprenticeships are a really important model universities should learn from, actually, because actually it's a much better model of study and work alongside each other. It's closer to what I was describing. And the question, say, what I was talking about prompts, is whether we start to think of higher and further education as much more integrated, actually.
Thanks. Titus Alexander, Democracy Matters. I particularly engage with your point about linking experience, local communities. Universities generate a huge amount of knowledge about social problems, but they don't equip people to use that knowledge to improve society. And so what I'm asking is, should universities do more to learn practical politics and civic engagement as part of their remit?
My question builds on that as well, which is around just how much knowledge sits within these institutions, which is actually quite hard to access as somebody who works in civil society. How do we democratise some of that knowledge? And that also includes some of the kind of IP that is created through some of the more robust and methodical creation of knowledge. Because even when universities are commercialising it, actually often they're doing that quite poorly. So how do we make sure that everybody benefits from the knowledge that's created?
Mm-hmm. So I think this is a really important point. I've got a colleague who, for about 10 years, worked with charities with single parents and teenage mums in Bristol. She then went back into university herself in her 20s. She said there were so many questions they were asking when she worked in those charities, and it simply never occurred to them to go to the university. And as soon as she was in the university, she found there was all this knowledge that they were looking for on an almost daily basis. There's sort of something wrong structurally in society.
But how do we do that, Tom? I mean, how do we democratise knowledge, your question?
To me, it's why the participation question is so important. Because actually, if you're in a situation, Bristol's a classic of this. Half the city has the highest participation rates in the country. Half the city has among the lowest. And so you've got whole geographical areas of the city where people don't see the university, don't go to the university, it's not part of their life, it wouldn't occur to them to go there. And you therefore need to find different ways that people interact with the university and feel the university is theirs, so that they start to have that daily relationship to it. And the model I'm suggesting is about undergraduates, but actually we could be doing that around research. Why is it that, when Hewlett-Packard come and say, we've got this problem, can you solve it for us? That's a natural relationship, but that doesn't work for the single-parent charity. We've got to democratize those kind of relationships.
Yeah. Michael, this is very relevant to some of the things you raised about accountability and democracy, but how, in practical terms, do you think can a university be responsive and to a local community in that way to share its knowledge? And does it have a role in educating students in democracy and political responsibilities?
I taught for many years at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and Kennedy School got lots of things wrong, but one of the things it got right, as a specific example, is teaming up with the city of Somerville, which lives on the borders of the university, and simply funneled students at the city of Somerville, which had problems. So every student interned with the city of Somerville and learned straight up why the garbage collection is no good, why the schools need to be better, why this, that, just plunging kids in the experience of, municipal government. I mean, and I'm sure there are universities in the UK that are doing this all the time. They need to do more. But let's be honest about another problem. I'm the one who's been up here walking around talking pretentiously about how important it is to, follow disciplines and produce knowledge. Some of the incentives in universities are just completely back to front. You're encouraged to publish stuff that has absolutely no relevance to anything other than debates in a discipline that are irrelevant to anybody, even the people in the discipline. So universities have to be, if we're going to be, places that criticize and seek to improve and seek to educate, we got to turn this searchlight on ourselves constantly. Some of the stuff we're generating is a result of perverse incentives. Second problem is that I think we're insufficiently curious about the societies we seek to serve. It's just kind of fundamental. Yeah. We go to work and don't engage with Bristol in some way. We're engaged with our discipline, our this, our that, and Khadija, we often do not serve students as well as we need to. And it means getting back to the basics. That's why I'm talking about a knowledge that is compassionate, that is engaged, that is curious, that is empirically driven. I can't name you a university that meets the ideal I've just outlined, or the ideal that Tom wants to outline. And that's why it's good to have this session, because we're a hell of a long way from where we need to be. But these institutions matter, and I love them, and I wish we could narrow the gap.
What changes are policymakers prepared to make to ensure universities are fit for the future? But I want to turn that into what changes would you like to see policymakers affect to ensure that universities are fit for the future?
Sure. Well, first of all, that they aren't so expensive, that to the point where they're an investment that can put people off university to begin with. But as a policy, I think it's to stop detaching and finding theory so sacred and removing it sometimes from the practice that is so integral to future-proof those degrees in and of itself. It's very hard for us to read a book, especially, I'm basing this off of my degree, digital culture. Some of the content that we read will be obsolete in a month's time. It's not useful. We need to be able to have practice so closely intertwined to the theory that we learn for those degrees to be relevant.
Fantastic. Thank you, Khadija. Tom, what would you like to see change, and any other reflections on what you've heard?
I think it's been fascinating to hear these different perspectives come together. I mean, if I was making policy changes, I think we need to move to a graduate tax rather than tuition fees. I think, free education doesn't work, but I think our system is storing up all sorts of problems. And I think we need to radically rethink our admissions criteria, because I think a lot follows from that. We're playing games at the moment with which A-level students go to universities, and that's always going to be a narrow set of the population.
Well, and what do you mean by review our admissions criteria? Could you just expand on that a bit?
Well, we've got a model of this, which is the Open University, which has taken people without prior qualifications for about 50 years. So I think we need to look seriously at where we can roll that out on a kind of national level, and make sure there's kind of good practice about being inclusive about who we admit sort of well beyond the net that we're currently casting.
Right. No entry criteria. Michael, what's your reflection on any of these points?
Well, I'm with Tom. I'll sign up with anything he wants to do, but I just emphasize the apprenticeship point.
Yeah.
We need to be investing a great deal more in learning through doing with employers out in the community, number one. Number two, governments need to invest much more in all programs that encourage internships and learning in the community and learning by serving in the community. And third, as bloody country gets out of Europe, this government needs to invest in a British equivalent of Erasmus, so that every young person in this country can spend a semester in Barcelona or Gdansk or Hungary or wherever. I mean, the re-provincialization of this country as a result of Brexit is something that governments ought to have the vision to counteract by putting the kids on the road. Three things.
And if universities don't have a global role, then I think we are in real trouble. My reflection on this, I think this has been a completely fascinating debate. What's emerged to me really strongly is how we can ensure this open textured reconfiguration of universities that yet is really gritty in the way that it engages in the real world issues that you've described and the reality of people's lives. And I absolutely agree. I think if we could move to a model, the one that's often in my mind is how you do music grades. You choose when you do them. Yeah. You can do grade 2 when you're in your 50s. And you build it up until you have real expertise in playing a musical instrument. Not something I have, but I think it's a really interesting model. And yet we don't do that, or at least not in terms of the traditional provision. But, and this is a massive but, I am so pleased, Michael, that you started with knowledge and fact, because actually, if we lose that, if that gets divorced from what universities are about, we are in such serious trouble, because who else is going to do that? Who else is going to aspire to find out and establish what's true and what's not true? I think it has to be the role of higher education to play that role as well as an absolute cornerstone of everything else it does. So this is a really rich and diverse discussion. But can I just finish by thanking you all for your really informed attention and questions and comments, but most of all, thanking our fantastic speakers here.
Thank you.
And thanking Nesta as well.